Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our Twitter Spaces. We've been calling this Creative Decentralization. If you haven't been before, this is our attempt to invite inspiring people that are building great things in Web3 to come share their insights with us and help us learn how to build our own things better and more meaningfully. And hopefully by doing these conversations out in the open, we can shine a light on how these people are thinking about the world and new opportunities for you as builders and creators, either places to work or things that you should build yourselves. And this is our fourth in the series. We've been lucky enough to have three awesome speakers before, and you can go actually listen to those conversations on our YouTube channel already. And today for our fourth conversation, I am really excited to be joined by Pooja Shah, founder of Tephra and the creators of Radius. And let's see, so a couple things. If you aren't familiar with Tephra, their mission is to enable large-scale human coordination to address some of humanity's most important challenges. And I think human coordination is such a hot topic right now that I think we can get into some really cool stuff. And some other kind of tidbits that are in there. They really focus on the infrastructure to scale decentralized networks and enable better coordination and collaboration. And they also have this belief around independent workers rather than employees and how to sort of tailor products to them. And through their first product, Radius, I think is where they're exploring kind of their first take at this and how to get those workers on. And so I've known Pooja for a while, and I'm always learning awesome things from her. So I'm excited to continue that today. Welcome, Pooja. How's it going?
Hello, it's going really well. Thank you for the very nice introduction. And yes, super inspired always by everything that Andrew and the amazing team over at Tableland and Textile are doing too. So yeah, really excited to dive into this hot topic.
Okay, a couple places to start, but I always like to give a little bit of calibration to folks that aren't familiar with your work. Maybe we just start with Tephra. Can you tell everybody a little bit about what it is and the mission and where you're going with that?
Yes, definitely. So yeah, I'm sure most folks have not heard about Tephra Labs because it is extremely new and we haven't really even formally announced it yet. But the mission, as you mentioned, is to build technology and infrastructure to enable large-scale human coordination. And really where this came from was just kind of a couple of things that we've been observing over like the last year, I would say, and just trickles of like other tidbits of observations over the last several years before that as well. But just this kind of observation that a lot of the challenges and opportunities that humanity is going to face, that we're already facing and that we're definitely going to be facing over the next several decades, are going to require a different type of coordination than what we as a species have sort of leaned on in the past. So the like traditional government structures and like nation state government structures and corporations have been kind of the dominant forms of coordinating people towards accomplishing things over the last many decades and hundreds of years and centuries. So, but as we're seeing like some of the biggest challenges and opportunities that we face today, like we're trying to use these same structures to address things like climate change and the opioid epidemic in the US and things like, you know, coordinating lots of companies to make sure we're building AI in the safe way, and things like that. But these structures are too limited. And so we're seeing that there's kind of like some resistance that we face being able to actually really make significant progress against some of these like big challenges and opportunities. It's not that like progress isn't being made, but it's not like enabling us to really coordinate hundreds of millions of people in a really fluid way, which at Tephra Labs, we believe is going to be really important in order to actually address these challenges and opportunities. So we saw this in like the example, the reason we believe that decentralized networks really have a lot of potential here is just learning from the experiments that we've seen within the Ethereum ecosystem and some of the other ecosystems in Web3, where there is a like loose coordination structure, which is not like, you know, everyone works for the Ethereum Foundation or like any particular company. And it's not like a government structure either, you know, where there's this, again, like sort of this centralized coordinating hierarchy. But it still kind of feels like they're, you know, the Ethereum ecosystem has like hundreds of thousands of people that sort of feel like they're all rowing in the same direction. And there are a lot of components to that, but that was kind of some of the inspiration behind what we thought could be really powerful. And a lot of it has to do with like using financial incentives in the right way and building the right like culture and ethos around some of these communities so that you know people actually feel like they're part of something that's like bigger than the sum of the, you know, individual parts or whatever it is. But yeah, that's kind of where this initially came from. And yeah, happy to dive into
I have a bunch of questions kind of around that Web3 angle, but maybe before we get there, also just because I mentioned it in the intro, Radius is sort of the first project coming out of Tephra Labs. How do you see it fitting in? Like where like, is this just one of a suite of products, or is there some specific experiment you're running with Radius, or where does it come from?
Totally. Yeah. Radius is, so we definitely plan to build more products out of Tephra Labs, but so Radius was specifically like, if we think of, you know, there's this huge problem, which is like humanity's largest challenges and opportunities, coordinating hundreds of millions of people. That's obviously like a really big and hard problem. And that's going to be like, we're not going to get there immediately. Right. So the first thing was just noticing, and this kind of comes from some of my personal background at Protocol Labs, where I was for like the last many years, leading many of our product and engineering teams. And just noticing that even within a particular like Web3 ecosystem, there sometimes is this, like the vision that we had at Protocol Labs for what IPFS and Filecoin as projects would be able to accomplish was way bigger than the team of like employees at Protocol Labs would have ever been able to do, right? And so it was just like this recognition that there's just going to be a gap between how much we're able to like hire into the organization and where we think these networks really need to go. And that gap needs to be covered by like the broader ecosystem and the community. And it's not just like, you know, auxiliary stuff that we want the community layer to be building, right? It's like really like stuff that's on the core roadmap for these projects. And so that was kind of like the initial challenge that that I was like spending a lot of time thinking about, basically, was how do we accomplish these really ambitious roadmaps in a way that feels like, you know, there isn't really at all the separation between a core development team in quotes and like the folks who are not like direct employees of, you know, the founding company or something like that. So that was kind of the initial, when we were thinking about this in the context of IPFS and Filecoin and other Protocol Labs projects. We had learned from like a lot of the just success that we had engaging really amazing teams with grants on parts of the core roadmap for these projects. And so the vision originally for Radius was like finding ways to kind of chart roadmaps for these ecosystems and then placing grants on parts of these roadmaps that we didn't really have a way to staff and resource. And in doing that, like, you know, we could, because these were like important problems, the grants could be large in size, which like solves a number of things because it enables us to like attract some of the best teams to work on these types of problems. And it's also like big enough that, you know, it's like provides some stability for the teams that are working on these projects. They have like a few months to dig into something as opposed to like a couple of days or weeks, like smaller, you know, so in contrast to smaller bounties, and gives them an opportunity to learn really about the ecosystem. And so, you know, the first grant, generally these grants have, for the most part, I think gone extremely well. And so there's like useful work that's produced, but then there's also this beautiful byproduct, which is people who are like onboarded into the ecosystem and can now do a bunch of like really amazing work and come up with their own ideas for how to add value to the ecosystem and so on down the road. So that's kind of like the experiment we're running with Radius is, can we scale this effect?
Yeah. Okay. I have a dozen follow-on questions to that now too, but I don't want to race too fast. Actually, the last thing I kind of want in the calibration here is actually just, what was your journey? How did you end up here? Share a little bit of that.
Okay. So my journey, I honestly just feel so fortunate because it's like one of these things where I think lots of before this moment, I think a lot of elements of my past would have felt like, oh, these are kind of really random experiences.
I always have this feeling. And then suddenly it's like an arrows line. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is how I know it's the right path, because it all makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I think my past, so I guess, I've always been extremely passionate about education. Personal mission statement of mine is that I really do believe that individuals are so powerful and can do anything that they want. But that there are like obstacles in our society that make it hard for people to do that. And so that was my personal mission always, ever since I was like a teenager, was to try to remove as many of those obstacles and create as many opportunities as possible so people could live up to their full potential. Younger days started like educational nonprofits and things. And then when I was in, college and so on, became really interested in technology and entrepreneurship as a way to address this like core mission and build solutions for people. So I started a number of projects related to different types of personal computing, started a virtual reality company. Ultimately, the way I entered Web3 was I had known the team at Protocol Labs for a little while and reached out to basically do an internship at Protocol Labs. And that summer that I was an intern, I had conversations with people about brain-computer interfaces and how, when we're in that future, we really don't want to be on the internet infrastructure we have today. It's just going to be scary. It's like our most deepest personal data living on Google Cloud and potentially being monetized, or there being a temptation to monetize that data feels really the wrong path for us as a species. And so that was kind of my the thing that convinced me that I wanted to work in Web3. And that was, so for 4 years was the head of product at Protocol Labs, leading a number of different initiatives and focused really heavily on IPFS and Filecoin and how to build that into really robust data infrastructure for Web3. But now it's kind of feels like coming back, learning some of the principles of how things work in this space, but also seeing the opportunities, kind of tying some of what I'm really excited about also with Radius and Tephra Labs is some of the educational programs that we're going to be spinning up. And it kind of feels like it brings back some of that, those early roots.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So now, I think maybe the area that I want to dig into first is actually related maybe to one of your passions around removing obstacles, because it feels a little bit like maybe Radius, with Tephra Labs, it seems like the mission is pretty non-specific to Web3. You don't really need, there's no reason that Web3 is the solution there. But with Radius, you have a real clear focus on Web3 ecosystems and enabling new engagement there. And so I'm curious, do you think Web3 has been sort of better suited or better able to remove obstacles for new people to join? Do you think it's been better than other ecosystems? And if so, why? Or what's happening there, do you think?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think it falls on both sides of this line, because I think on the one hand, there's this really inclusive vibe within Web3, which is just really welcoming, really wanting as many people as possible to participate. Even just some of the cultural phrases in Web3 that have really taken off, GM and whatever, they're a little, I guess, not inclusive maybe to people who see that and don't really know what it means, but it's easy to find the definition of it. And then once you do, to participate and feel like you're a part of a community. And so I think from that perspective, I think that there is this desire for openness and collaboration. And I think some of it, again, goes back to just the, some of the early principles of how value is created in Web3, and this idea of value accruing to the protocol layer, and that being fundamentally, in a lot of cases, a non-competitive thing. So it really is we all succeed if others succeed. We're all going to succeed if the whole space succeeds, right? So I think there is that vibe for sure. At the same time, I do think that Web3 can feel really exclusive in terms of how do you actually work in the space. It feels there is, and this is part of what we wanted to solve as well with Radius, right? But it's like, it can be hard to get a job for the first time at a Web3 company if you've never worked in Web3 before, even if you're like a really skilled person. And like, we're top of your game or whatever, like in Web2 land. And so I think I think that there are a lot of reasons for it. I think largely a lot of those reasons aren't very good. And it just comes down to like, creating the right structures so that we can like provide people with resources so they can self-serve, but also in some cases provide them with a more structured experience so they feel like, yeah, I can do this job. It's basically the same thing. There's some like new things to learn, but you have to learn something new anytime you do something new anyway. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. But I think the general cultural vibe is really good. And I think that's not true in other industries as much. Like for example, AI, I think it's exclusive and hard to enter, but also doesn't have like the warmth and welcoming nature either. So, it's probably better, all things considered.
Yeah. Okay. That's super interesting. So with Radius, then do you think like how sort of in the life cycle of somebody collaborating on one of these projects, does Radius primarily focus on that early phase of the life cycle, getting people on board and getting them attached to projects? Or are you imagining a role all the way, like do people stay with Radius as almost a career and continue contributing to projects?
I mean, I think again, the hope is that it will be both. I mean, I think really right now where I would say we're focusing is kind of that first entry point. And that's why like right now, our mission is, and will always be like the mission, it's going to take a long time to get there, but it's onboarding the next billion workers into Web3. So it's really focused on that early stage of helping to do some of this initial training. We're like working, like I mentioned, on some of the educational components. We're building out this like content library and also going to have kind of a fellowship program as well. And then ultimately like helping to bring people into their first projects within a particular Web3 ecosystem and provide them with some support basically as they're going through that first project. The hope, so that is, I think, the first thing that we're planning to focus on, but there is this like larger belief here, which I think has yet to be proven out in the world more generally, but it's like really wanting to show that we think it's possible. You can build a like very lucrative career as an independent worker and not have it end really ever. And like, because I think in today's world, a lot of this is like being a freelancer or being an independent contractor somewhere feels always like it's a temporary thing and it'll end one day when you get that next full-time job. And, and I think there are lots of, again, reasons. Some of this is just societal, right? It's like so many of our social structures aren't geared towards like, how do you get a mortgage if you don't have W-2 income in the US? It's like really, really hard to do that. And you end up with more predatory banks and like, that's not a good path for people. So there is like some of this that we hope to be able to affect down the road so that people like, it should be more, also freelancing generally is not that lucrative, right? And you don't have an equity component to freelance work generally. So it's like these types of things we're trying to address with Radius too, so that it can be like a lifelong way of working and giving people just way more flexibility and autonomy and like that stability that you would generally get from a full-time job, but through some sort of system like this.
So yeah, I guess to do that, you also need to tackle a lot of the challenges of like identity and skill verification and credit and merit. How are you thinking of that? Is that like, are those core problems that you also need to tackle, or are there other projects that you end up having to lean on, or does it just come together as a community? How are you thinking about that?
This is a big open question. I think you're right. It is a core part of the thing. And I think the preference would be to just leverage. I know there are a ton of projects that in the space right now, especially in the last like 6 months, I don't know, identity and reputation has just become crazy. So there are a ton of really interesting projects that I think we would love to collaborate with in order to build out what this system will look like. But I think for now, it's not super clear. And I think a lot of people are still, figuring out what their solution is going to look like. So it's a sort of thing where we're going to wait for a few months to just kind of see how that space evolves. But in the meantime, we are working on certain things like, so there's one idea, which is actually, a little bit inspired from Protocol Labs, which I know you're familiar with as well, Andrew, is kind of this idea of like a salary function and kind of like a consistent leveling mechanism. And so what I think this is like a really great idea that Protocol Labs implemented was basically leveling people according to effectively a rubric, and then having their compensation be literally just the outputs of that leveling process, and then being able, like, people could just compute, this is what my salary is going to be. And it was just really nice because I think, as a lot of us know, things like, salary, like if it's not standardized in this way, can become a negotiation process, which like ends up being unfair to certain types of groups, right? Like women and minorities tend to be like, just end up getting the shorter end of the stick in a lot of these processes. And so removing some of the bias and unfairness in that process is something that I think is really great. And so one of the things that we're working on right now is figuring out, like, what do these types of ladders look like? And, it's going to be hard. These are all really hard, very contentious problems. And a lot of people will hate, like our first attempts, but we're going to try to basically come up with like some version of this, and like leveling ladders and things for like various different roles, and coming up with some suggestions basically for what compensation should look like, so that there can be more fairness across this system as well. And then, anyways, people are always, it's a marketplace, and like people are always going to deviate from that recommendation, but at least we're hoping there can be a little bit more standardization and less of this kind of like race to the bottom like effect, which can sometimes happen in these types of labor markets. So yeah,
it feels a little bit like it almost is like a two-way. I'm familiar with Protocol Labs, and two others that I know do this really in interesting ways are Buffer and GitLab. And with those, well, with all those, they're all slightly different. And so I feel like there's actually this opportunity for like a two-way sort of equation, like dashboard. Like when I think of like, how am I going to pay this person? It's actually not how I'm going to pay this person. It's like what's important in this role.
Yes.
And I could, like, if I had little sliders to say, oh, this skill is super valuable, oh, but this one is less, and what pops out is a value per person based on how well they match those different sliders. That sort of thing seems really fascinating. I hadn't really thought of like a ecosystem-wide slider yet, so that's pretty that's pretty neat. And that's also related to something that I think about a lot, which are like, if you were to work in a Google, there's, along with the ladders, like are your roles in the company, and there's some top-down idea of how you progress through the organization. How do you think think people in this future would find training, find like the support for growth, like, or do they just have to self-manage that?
Totally. I think that's, I think the hope is, this is not at all a complete solution for sure. So we're definitely open to lots of other ideas here, but the hope is that things like these ladders can at least provide some sense of like, here's one view. And, there could be like again, just a bunch of different experiments here with like, what does career progression look like in different roles, but publishing these resources openly so people can kind of use that as a roadmap for themselves and say, okay, a few different people have evaluated me according to this rubric, and this is kind of where I fall. And like, if I want to get to the next level, these are some of the things that I might want to do. And like, I think just the openness of those resources can be really helpful. Like in addition to the companies you mentioned, there's also Circle CI, which has their like engineering competency matrix, I think is a really good one, and kind of was intended to actually serve this exact purpose within their organization, but they published everything. So it's now been a helpful resource for other companies too. But yeah, I think that it's a little bit like, I think because companies like Google and others do have managers, there's more of a forcing function for providing direct feedback and support to individuals. But the quality of that is also not like consistent. So I think it's just kind of like across the board, how do we I don't know, like an idea that we've had, which we're going to be doing with the fellowship program, but is to have like mentors basically for people who are going through the fellowship. And, that could be like a lasting relationship, even though it's not someone who maybe is working on the same style of, or the same, like in the same ecosystem or whatever, but can just be like a resource for people, for the fellows. But yeah, I don't know. I think it would be very cool to have some sort of like, decentralized mentorship network or something. But yeah.
Because there's two ideas I think of there, which are like, in a traditional org, there's always those good people that then identify future good people, and they'll tell them that, they'll identify excellence, and they'll like find ways to, like you're saying, mentor them and make sure that they have the opportunity to grow into that. But at the same time, I started thinking like, there's also people that check all the boxes on expertise in a certain bucket, but they're just amazing, they're just amazing at accumulating knowledge or learning new skills. And so they could move off to totally new buckets of skills, and in a very short amount of time, be exceptional at those things too. So how do we as an ecosystem sort of fund those journeys? Like put capital behind really great people to go build totally new skills, because we need them to be great over there too. I guess maybe that rolls into some of your thinking around fellowships and betting on people a bit, or?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there are, again, these are just in idea stages, but like actually having there be real ways where you can like, invest in people and like potentially, I don't know, like maybe they contribute back to you or something for being an early supporter of theirs, like on their journey, right? And helping them get off the ground. So yeah, I think that would be something to explore for sure.
So it's like really obvious that the way that we're thinking about collaboration and the workforce and these relationships is so impacted by everything that's been happening in Web3 and this like rapid year of experimentation around DAOs in particular. But like before that, a lot of the protocol foundations and projects told us a lot about what might be possible. And I'm curious, like how much you're like learning from that, and maybe even if you think there are some really interesting models that have emerged or organizations that you're like taking a lot of ideas from. I guess PL is obviously one of them.
Yes, PL is definitely one of them. Yeah. Yeah, let's see. I mean, I think in general, some of these, I guess L1, L2 projects that like did go through this process of going from company to more like the more decentralized model or wanted to do that. So Near and Maker are two other examples. That's obviously not, those organizations didn't start out like as DAOs. So I think that there definitely are learnings in the other direction as well for organizations that are trying to build themselves in this way. And so, but I think I think some of the big ones, obviously, there's like, I think Constitution DAO is an interesting example. Again, that's like not, that's not a product organization or like an engineering organization, but just the ability to leverage, it's just like, yeah, how do we orchestrate incentives, or like the fact that they're just like a really clear economic transaction in that case was able to like very quickly align a huge number of people, and kind of like the culture of that particular movement, I think was interesting. And so, yeah, but I like, to be honest, I think that a lot of we're definitely like paying a ton of attention to what's happening. And other groups too, like we're, talking to Developer DAO. I know you guys like also know them super well. But I think some of the groups that are also trying to do a lot of onboarding of people into Web3, like there's some interesting learnings there. Also like Gitcoin's kernel and BuildSpace and other groups like this. But specifically in like the DAO world, I think there's still like, there's a huge amount of experimentation, which is really good, but not yet like a non-obvious. I don't feel like there have been non-obvious results that much yet from like DAO experiments organizationally. I don't know if you see something different there.
No, I have like an opinion, but no facts.
Okay, yeah.
My opinion is that probably during the bull market, we saw an exuberance of contributions that were likely undercompensated and under-delivered. So like we had people putting DAOs together where they wanted a lot of people being able to contribute and trying to open that up. And then we had a lot of lackluster contributions and people actually probably not feeling like they got compensated properly for what they did do. So just sort of like lots of mismatches. And I'm actually really excited about this, like get down, heads down to work period, because I think maybe a lot of that gets clarified and they figure it out. But yeah, I mean, I think that like that really, that's like a big question in my mind is like how much of what you're thinking is predicated on how we think of organizational structures. Like to get to where you're imagining what does an organization look like, even to just, I mean, I guess there's different phases of what you're imagining. Like what does an organization look like that can leverage radius? And then like, what does an organization look like that can fulfill some of the ideas and the mission of Tephra?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, I think like the way it's actually how it is. Sometimes it's like really, it's kind of easier to envision like the long-term picture more than it is like the short-term thing, where the short-term thing just looks like you're not exactly sure how it's going to unfold, that certain things will change, like in which order, but you kind of know where it needs to get to. So for me, it's easier to think about what does an organization look like in the Tephra vision of the world. And I think for me, that looks like there being a fairly, like, I think, the primitives look like some way of collecting direction for an ecosystem, which could look like different people's and different organizations' interpretations of what roadmaps look like. And that could be blog posts, like the way that Vitalik writes blog posts, or it could be like the Foresight Institutes, like trying to map out these massive areas of scientific research and technology and actually drawing trees, like tech trees, but some, or something else, right? But there's some notion of like what direction looks like. And then people being able to attach funding to any of those directions or some direction that they think is important. And then having a really fluid system where people are able to work on that, right? And I think a lot of it's not even going to look like the Radius website, right? But it's like the protocols that will underlie all of this stuff. And there will be like thousands of interfaces that are built on top of this. But like that core idea of there being, direction, funding, and then people, and like being able to match all of those things in a pretty like fluid way is what I think future organizations will look like. And it's not going to feel like, I'm sure there will still be companies for sure, and there will still be governments, but there, I think, will be this other like connecting layer, which is kind of, the incentive layer between all of it, which I think will be really important to enable this kind of like meta coordination stuff that we've talked about a little bit. And it's kind of cool because starting from where we are today, there are things that are already happening that I think are examples of this. And you kind of, if you just squint a little and zoom out and add some like protocols and some like, clever incentives to stuff, it kind of starts to look like that. Like I was reading about IBM has this like whole team. It's like a 70-person team within IBM, which is called the Talent Assignment Agency. And they literally do this process of like helping people within IBM deconstruct larger projects into like smaller chunks of work, and then matching, like people can self-elect into these smaller chunks of work that they want to work on, and they kind of have like a bonus system or something that's like associated with that. And this group also helps like, they have this big database basically of all of the people within IBM and also within their network of client partners as well. And they can help orchestrate like talent exchange programs, basically talent exchanges between their client partners and IBM. And so it's kind of interesting because it's like IBM feels like this really, really rigid, like traditional institution. But even in that context, there's kind of some experimentation with this idea of like a really permeable organization and a different way of thinking of work, which is more deconstructed. So I think like that's interesting. And I think that will continue to proliferate basically.
Yeah. So you're getting at something I've really been thinking about a lot lately, which is one path that we could go down is that we could just continue to see a proliferation of smaller and smaller DAOs that are much more specific and tactical in what exactly they do, and those DAOs not being, and basically like then larger ideas being able to be pulled off by smaller and smaller core teams by leveraging these smaller DAOs to come in and execute specific tracks. That gets me really excited because there's so many projects that we have that if we just had like a small team of experts that could come in instead of hiring totally new roles or having to vet a totally new person, it's just like use the track record of this small org, and we know that their incentives are aligned and that they have their own, performance filtering and brand that they're building. That really excites me, and I'm curious if you see that kind of model ever fitting into Radius. Like, could groups of people ever join Radius to grow together?
100%. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And actually that's like a pretty near-term thing we want to be able to enable, is this idea of teams, and also having people, you can be part of a static, like permanent, semi-permanent team, but also you could, join up with different teams for like different types of projects, and having that flexibility too of like that group layer. So yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. And that's also something, as we've been building out the Tephra Labs team, that has been really interesting to experiment with too. And it's kind of, it's interesting because I know with Textile and Tableland, you've also done a lot of non-traditional things in terms of like how to engage with different types of contributors. And it's interesting because a lot of it works, it's like, it's kind of, there's like this really like the traditional like lore or whatever in Silicon Valley is that you can't build a company in this way, but it's just not true, because there's proof, like we're doing it and it works. So yeah.
I mean, I think it just takes a different mindset and a different, probably like different founders and leaders originally. Like if you set up a traditional startup to just run in with the Silicon Valley playbook, you'll do fine, but you won't arrive to these same conclusions very easily. Totally. They just work. Or things are working. I wouldn't say they just work, but so maybe actually that was a question I wanted to ask you anyway. And so that was a good intro to that. Like, how are you building Tephra Labs internally? Like, how are you thinking about things differently? And is there anything you can share that others might be inspired by, or that you think is like an experiment that you don't know the conclusion of, or how are you doing that?
Totally. Yes. So I'd say it's basically, I think we are dogfooding this idea of like, it's, all sorts of contributions and contributors. And that's the other thing too, like we describe the team as like Tephra Labs contributors, not, team or whatever, which like feels, I think has a lot of baggage associated with that. I mean, it doesn't, not necessarily, but for some people it does. We, the group of Tephra Labs contributors includes people who are full-time. It also includes people who are part-time, who are like, more salaried part-time folks, but there's also people who are like, being paid hourly. There are like agencies and mini DAOs that we have worked with and like will work with in the future. So it's kind of really, I would say it's like it is a flexible like organization. And so I think that is something that feels, I think there is a good criticism of this type of structure, which is that, regardless of how workers engage within an organization, it is important to have some amount of consistency and continuity. Otherwise, the project will lose steam, right? Like we've seen this a lot with a lot of like DAOs that were kind of like, flash in the pan, like got a huge community really quickly and the core team was excited about it, but then something didn't quite work out and people lost interest and then the DAO just dies. And I think that that's important. And I think that tends to come from either it's, it could just be one person who's the founder who's providing that continuity. But I think somehow that is important to like have. But anyways, I think like people can engage in lots of different ways and the team can still feel cohesive and like it's part of something and to feel bonded as well. And then the other thing that we're doing too is like, there are a lot of people that are on, I guess, the Tephra Labs contributors who don't have like super deep experience in Web3. And again, that's, just dogfooding this idea of like, it can be learned, right? Like we all had to learn it at some point. And And there is this like great byproduct that now people are onboarded and they'll go forth and do amazing things, whether or not they continue to contribute to Tephra Labs in the future. So
totally. This is a random kind of question that you made me think of, is like in this kind of future model, like right now, if you have a team that you hire, there's that hire is forever until they choose to leave or you fire them. And in this model, what happens to things like firing? Like what happens to like parting ways with people? Is that just something that happens when a project ends and they don't get a new project? Or is there like some kind of conversation? Like what happens? Like, how do you imagine that?
yeah. Yeah, I think it is that, I mean, sometimes I think even in this model, like it just doesn't work out. I think it depends on like the type of work that is being done too. Like there are some things that are just more arm's length and less integrated with like other contributors. And so that, yeah, it's like, oh, the project ends and, even if it's not going like perfect, like not amazing, then you can just sort of like let it come to its natural completion. But yeah, sometimes, I mean, I think culture is still a real thing. And like, people being a part of like the cohesive whole, sometimes like that just it doesn't work out. And I think, yeah, sometimes we do have to end the relationship. And I think that, but the thing that's nice about this way is that it is really like the definition of at will. Like, I mean, every hiring contract has like, yes, this is at will employment, right? Like that's a phrase in every single like employment contract pretty much. But a lot of times like companies and individuals will just let things like fester or like drag on for way longer, even though it's not really like a mutually beneficial relationship. And I think this model just makes it easier to recognize when things aren't working out and then just kind of parting ways. So and there's not like hard feelings around it, because it's kind of embedded.
Yeah. And actually, I guess related to that, I was thinking like who makes those decisions and things. Do you have any strong opinions about hierarchies and like how hierarchies work in organizations in the future? If like back to, I'm putting it purely in the context of like Tephra's mission statement of like billion individuals collaborating on a project. What sort of hierarchies emerge?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there will be like, I don't think that like a billion person network can be totally flat. I think there's even just the notion of like, there's someone who is funding a particular result implies an evaluation, right? Like there is someone who is only going to continue funding your work, like so long as it meets certain criteria. And I don't think that this model means that we let go of those like standards and accountability, generally speaking. Again, it's more like it's for stuff that's like more directed, at least. I think that that's the case. And to some extent, I think the market will decide those things. But I think there will always be someone that will have to decide whether or not they think something is worth continuing to invest in, right? And it could be that like one person in the future, right? Like one person decides that they don't think it's worth it, but then someone else comes to fill that gap because they disagree. And like having more fluidity and openness in these types of funding structures, I think is also will enable that basically. But yeah, I mean, I do think that I definitely think that there are going to be I think we'll still definitely have companies that are just people that, are attacking a piece of the problem that they're really passionate about and they want to do it in a particular way. And that might include like a corporate structure or a governmental structure that looks really similar to what it looks like today. And I think those things will still have a place. But it just might be that, the boundaries between like, it's a lot more dotted lines and there isn't like a rigid like membrane around any of these groups. And it's maybe like a lot more porous and people can come and go more freely. I do think that that's going to start to be more of a shift. And again, I think that that's already sort of happening, right? Even with more traditional companies. Basically, I think every like major like tech company at this point employs contractors, right? And it's just kind of like slowly there will be more and often engages with like freelance workers in different ways and things like that. So I think that will just continue to become more standard, but I don't know.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and so then I guess the question I have, and I think from that I might know your answer, but is like, is there a role for a CEO in this future? I only asked that because both you and I happen to have that title, but I'm just curious, like, I feel like in my day to day, I keep just sort of stripping away as much of what you traditionally think of as a CEO, like, and then you wonder what's left if I'm successful, you know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's kind of like, does CEO become basically like BDFL or something? But that still kind of has the wrong vibe, because it's got the word dictator in it and for life, but but it's someone who's just like a little more at arm's length and one of the direction setters, as opposed to someone who's like really like the chief executive officer, right? Maybe it's someone who's like, I'm curious how you describe what your role is like today, but I think for me, a lot of it, my job right now, I feel like, is to provide that continuity and activation energy. Sometimes when, it's like without that, there may be certain areas that like wouldn't get addressed or something, but it's not necessarily to like, definitely it's still like a more traditional CEO role too, in a lot of ways, but I do think the most important parts of the role are those things: activation, energy, and continuity. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's something a little, my head immediately went to like enable the organization to, if as efficiently as possible, fulfill a vision. So there's like, you need to be able to have the vision, you need to make it work optimally, and you need to remove barriers or things like that. So I think I think about that a lot and spend a lot of time thinking about the phases of the org. So like where we are now versus where we need to be, and like what new structures will need to be in place. But I don't think that needs to be a CEO per se. And then I try to do a lot of like vision alignment, just chatting with people and see like what's known, what's not, what needs to be spelled out more, spend time writing documents, things like that. So I think a lot of that is kind of traditional CEO, but I do have this lingering wonder if I'm successful and other people start picking up on those things, and I'm not the only one, not to say I'm even the only one doing them now, but if they're really effectively happening across the org, like, maybe you become the benevolent dictator, but I don't like that at all. Yeah. I think I'm less dictator now than anything. So
right.
I don't have a good answer.
What's an alternative phrasing for that? It's like benevolent, like advisor or something, or guide, or I don't know, but something like that, which is
yeah. I think this is actually, I think this is a more interesting question than I thought when I asked it. Like, right. 2 minutes ago, I thought, okay, this will be a funny answer, but now I think it's actually a very interesting question. Is like, not even to say today, but like if we're successful with our individual projects, and the community is successful in a lot of the other projects that are happening, what is the new CEO? Right. To your question, like, what is the new, like, what do you call it then? And like, what is it really supposed to be doing? And is there like continuity from what it is today to what it is in 10 or 100 years? And especially if like Tephra Labs is successful with its mission, if you have an organization of billions of people, you don't probably want a benevolent dictator, because that's too easy of a trigger to become, like, if they decide not to be benevolent, right? So we need to think of something different. I just don't know what it is.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of like the soft power of, I think the closest thing is like activists, like, people like Greta Thunberg and MLK and people like that. It's like there's this, but I don't know. But I think there is going to be a role. There are going to be roles like that. It probably won't just be one. There will be many people like that.
Totally.
But they're activators, and like they do help move things in a direction, but they don't like directly manage an org chart or a tree of any kind of people. But I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, we'll think about that. We'll return to that one. Let's revisit that one in a year and see what we think. We'll replay this part of it. So I did, just because the moment we're living in, I wanted to kind of leave with a couple questions about the current market, and specifically, like, if this bear market lasts for a while, what do you think it's going to do to the Web3 workforce? is that
Yeah.
exuberance still going to be there? Is that pipeline, like the pipeline of new heads, going to be there? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like you, I think that like more bear markets are really awesome for a lot of reasons. And I think it is a really generally, at least historically, has been a good time to build. I think that there probably is going to be some amount of, if it continues for a very long time, let's say it continued for 10 years or so, I think that would definitely shrink the like interest in terms of new people entering the space. But I think that I just think that, you know, really the bet is on the long term and what are these things going to look like longer term. And I think that like, first of all, there is this thing, right, of like Web3 basically eating the world and everything basically becoming a Web3 like project or company at some point. So I think to some extent, every new thing, I think one day will be like have a Web3 component. And so if people are interested in that mission, it'll be like, yes, they're kind of entering Web3 as well. And I do think like Web3 on its own, like kind of the evolution of what the industry looks like today will definitely recover, right? Like just the market will definitely recover. So yeah, I think longer term, I'm definitely not worried about that. And I think just like it feels like, you know, now it's never a bad or late time to enter the space. And now, like, I mean, I entered the space in a bear market like 2018 after the ICO, you know, craze of 2017. And it was an amazing time to enter the space because just formed like amazing connections with people that were building real stuff. And just the quality of the conversations was so good. And the opportunities were like for growth individually were so amazing. And my career like really took off during that period. And so I think if it were to persist, like there's a lot of good things will come out of it too. I think in terms of, I think you're right that the mission for Tephra Labs is not just for Web3. And I think that a lot of the models here apply to more than just Web3 ecosystems. And if there isn't enough like if Web3 contracts and they're like, you know, organizations and ecosystems aren't looking to like grow in the same way, then we would probably just start working with like Web2 companies and other groups sooner. But yeah, but I think eventually it will all right itself. So not worried. Yeah.
Okay, then just to leave anybody in the audience with some ways that they can get involved if they're looking at what Radius does, where should they start and what should they be looking to do?
Yes. Well, okay. So if you're looking to get involved, definitely check out our website, which is radius.space. And there's a bunch of links, but you can join the Discord, and that's probably right now, you know, we're all super active on Discord and like really looking to help people who are interested in getting started. And yeah, trying to build like different sorts of communities, like the educational programs I mentioned. All of this is stuff that we're like releasing really, really soon. We're announcing a couple of exciting things in the next couple of days. So yeah, just stay tuned, check out radius.space. And I think also follow us on Twitter. That would probably be helpful. That's where we'll post a bunch of announcements about things. And yeah, definitely come chat with us because we really do truly love meeting everyone and want to know people's stories and what is exciting them in this moment and how we can support you. So yeah.
So good. I've really enjoyed this conversation and I always enjoy our conversations. So just another one in the books. Thanks very much for your time and thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew.